Thank you very much to my colleagues. Good morning to everybody here. Good morning to the President. Good morning to His Excellency the Ambassador, Honorable Member of Parliament, Mr. Imtiaz Bakir Marker. To everybody here, friends of Palestine, thank you for the opportunity. I want to just clarify something that I would not call myself an expert on the subject. I'm very much a student, as you can see, and I've been paid a compliment to say I'm young and energetic, so I'll do my best. It's a Sunday after all. I'm sure it's not the easiest for everybody. But I think part of the struggle to have this event reflects, as the President said, the struggle of the Palestinian people as well. Even to have an event, it's a struggle. Okay, it's not necessarily a political issue, but it's COVID, but these are all struggles in life, and few know about these struggles more than the Palestinian people. So, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is what I call foundational to global left-wing politics. Left-wing politics tends to oversimplify this conflict sometimes. There's an oppressor-oppressed narrative, which is not wholly inaccurate, but I don't think it's the best way always to analyze the issue. My reading on the subject, and today's speech will include many quotations from some of the world's greatest intellectuals on this subject, including the Palestinian-American intellectual Professor Edward Said, his protege, Mrs. Hanan Ashrawi, the American Jewish political dissident Noam Chomsky, the author Christopher Hitchens, and many others. So I'll start with Mr. Christopher Hitchens, and he famously recited these lines, and I'll repeat them, quote, there are two populations, roughly equivalent in size, in the same territory, both with some claims to it, and it's been said many times that the solution seems straightforward, a partition to share what is there in the Middle East. Now, most Jews support this solution. Most Jews in Israel support it as per polling. Most Jews in America support it as per polling, as well as in the European Union. The American public supports it in general. The European Union supports it. The Arab League supports it. The United Kingdom supports it. China, Russia, they all support it. But yet, it seems impossible. So there's two main reasons. One, I believe, and many others believe, is the unilateral action of the United States and the State of Israel. And the other, as Christopher Hitchens describes, has three groups. One group is a group of messianic settlers who believe that if they can pull all the Jewish people from around the world, make them convert to the right orthodoxy, that the Messiah will come. They are opposed by another group that believe the land was promised to them as per their religious beliefs. And there's another third faction that isn't discussed nearly enough, and that is the fundamentalist Christian lobby in the United States. They also support the State of Israel to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars every year as part of a biblical prophecy. Now, I just want to, since Dr. Wijetileke was mentioned here, I will make a special mention. I was lucky enough to have an interview with Dr. Wijetileke in May this year during the most recent escalation in Gaza. And Dr. Wijetileke, you all know, is one of Sri Lanka's top intellectuals, and especially on the subject of Israel and Palestine, he is an authority in our country. He was a lead ambassador for the movement to take Palestine into UNESCO. So I intend on quoting him extensively in this because I think his work is important. Now, to quote once again Mr. Hitchens, he has claimed that the idea of Zionism, the idea of building a state of Jewish farmers, on Arab land in the Middle East, on the face of it, seems a ridiculous idea. I quote, "It should be a matter of principle. If Jews born in Brooklyn have a right to a state in Palestine, then Palestinians born in Jerusalem have a right to a state in Palestine. And anyone who doesn't agree with this principle is suspect," unquote. We now have over 45 years, maybe 55 years of Palestinians being born in exile, dispossession, or in occupation and humiliation. The International Court of Justice has officially recognized what it refers to as tantamount to the annexation of occupied territories, that which is referred to the State of Israel as disputed territories. But for the purpose of my analysis, I will consider these as occupied territories, pursuant to the ICJ ruling of 2004. Now, the Israeli state, its politics and its actions have long suggested that there is an emphasis on expansion rather than security. What Professor Noam Chomsky has referred to as the destruction of a nation. It's a rare event in history that's taking place over the last several decades. Conversely, I must also say there is a lack of appreciation among younger students of the conflict, especially considering the symbolism surrounding the formation of the State of Israel. Now, most people don't realize that it used to be considered a triumph of nation building, a triumph for an oppressed people suffering centuries of persecution. And the support for Israel was traditionally from the left. So Dr. Wijetileke, if he was alive in the 30s and the 40s, if he was a leftist, he would have supported the formation of the State of Israel. But now we realize that Israel itself was an imperial colonial promise. And some scholars also mention that Palestine can be considered as such through the Mokmohan-Hussein correspondence. Now, my own research on this issue stems from my interest in American politics and foreign policy. That was also the subject of my thesis for my master's. And when you study American foreign policy, you can't help but realize and notice the intertwined destiny of the State of Israel together with America's policies resulting from British colonialism and imperialism. Many scholars and intellectuals have noted that the United States has essentially picked up the baton of British and European imperialism. One example is the Vietnam War, which was a direct inheritance of French colonialism, while the US support for the State of Israel is an inheritance from British colonialism. Before we continue further, I want to highlight two major recent developments that are important to note. One was the joint naval drill carried out in the Red Sea a week ago between Israel, the United States, the UAE, and Bahrain, the first of its kind. It opens up questions. How far is Israel willing to act unilaterally? Especially considering the contentions around Iran, the Trump administration, several moves, and the Abraham Accords, etc. The second recent development was the UK government's ban on Hamas, which was made official just a few days ago. Now, there is some rationale in banning Hamas. You could also say it is a one-sided policy, and I'll discuss that further. But the most urgent issue in this ban, which I think the President also touched on, is that Hamas controls the flow of medicines, vital supplies to the Gaza Strip. And we must ensure, I hope the ambassador, I'm sure everyone will ensure the UK government hopefully made plans to prevent the supply chains from being disrupted and aid being received by these people who are suffering in the occupied territories. Now, in announcing the ban, there were references to the Hamas Charter. And I must just, in fairness, say that many people, representatives of Hamas, have stated that they don't relate to their charter anymore, that they don't pay attention to it. But I don't think it should reduce or extinguish what it says in the charter. The charter is deeply anti-Semitic. There is arguably a call to commit genocide, and there are several anti-Semitic tropes. But if we talk about charters, we should also consider the charter of the main constituent party of the previously ruling Likud. Likud is overtly secular, but the main constituent is a revisionist Zionist party called Herut, which essentially calls for the Jewish state in all of Palestine and all of Jordan. In fact, the first leader of Herut, Menachem Begin, visited New York City in 1948. And there was an op-ed published by the New York Times, signed by 20 Jewish American intellectuals, including Albert Einstein. They called Herut akin to Nazi and fascistic parties and a terrorist group. Another party in Israel, the Shas party, which at least under Prime Minister Netanyahu was in charge of the Ministry of Housing, is an overtly ethno-supremacist party. Now, just to briefly go through the history. The resolutions, as mentioned, the UN resolutions, the proposal of the UN Partition Plan 1947, the UN Resolution 194 1948, together with the 1974 resolutions that says two states, side by side, widely supported and accepted. As we mentioned before, this includes the Arab League, all the countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, Egypt, Qatar, Jordan, 22 countries in total. The US has vetoed, as per United Nations data, 53 resolutions since 1972. Whilst, rhetorically, all the presidents of my recent memory have supported the two-state solution. And during the May 2021 violence, the escalation of violence, the United States even blocked a UN statement calling for a ceasefire. Now, you will read a lot in the press, in the mainstream press, regarding Camp David and the meeting in the year 2000 between President Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat, and Ehud Barak. Now, the history of what happened at Camp David is a little bit complicated and fuzzy because there weren't written records as per officials. Now, the reasons for the failure, different people blame different sides. Some blame Mr. Arafat and the Palestinians for not accepting what was considered a very reasonable offer from Prime Minister Ehud Barak. One report stated that Mr. Barak's offer granted Palestinians 95% of everything they were asking for. But I did some research on this, and there's a lot of authors, especially at the time, who mentioned that if you look for the maps, and they presented these maps at all their councils, but these maps were very hard to find. You can find them now on Google. I think they've been around for a few years. And when you look at those maps, what Professor Noam Chomsky noted, and even Israeli scholars, and I'll come to the Israeli scholars later, they remark that what was called a magnanimous offer by Ehud Barak essentially created an Israeli salient to the east of Jerusalem. This salient breaks up the West Bank, creating what he calls cantons. Now, all this is part of the Foreign Policy Balancing Act of the United States. We know the Israel lobby continues its work in back rooms through AIPAC and many organizations. And we know that there's always been a political contention between Fatah and Hamas as well. The United States seems to admonish Israel in private, but provides tens of billions in military aid. They block UN resolutions, but considers itself the chief negotiator. President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu clashed several times. Prime Minister Netanyahu came to the United States and made a speech on the invitation of the Republican Party to a joint session of Congress, where he basically lambasted President Obama and the JCPOA with Iran. Every US president since Bill Clinton has signed a secret letter pledging not to even discuss publicly the Israeli nuclear program. But for all this, we know, everybody can see, that Israel is essentially a client state of the American empire. To quote Dr. Wijetileke, on the face of it, the Israeli-Palestinian question is structurally intractable and irretrievably deadlocked. As a formula, the two-state solution is the best there is. It builds on the logic of the UN resolution of 1948 of two states, Israel and Palestine. It is the most reasonable solution, but it was called into question from the beginning. Continue quote. The Arab armies opened hostilities, and the Israelis, having beaten them soundly, did not stop at the borders traced by the UN resolution, which, with certain modifications due to strategic imperatives, would have been the most just and rational action. Instead, there was not only annexation, but also the eviction of Palestinian Arabs after the war had been won. The Arabs erred by refusing to accept the UN resolution, which even Stalin's Russia was enthusiastic of, and also by refusing to accept the legitimacy of the creation of the State of Israel, which, after the Holocaust, was morally and historically irresistible. Now, on the subject of Israeli politics, the present situation is that Benjamin Netanyahu is out, for now, but knowing Mr. Netanyahu, you never know for how long. In the meantime, the coalition is a little bit uncomfortable. The current Prime Minister, Mr. Naftali Bennett, was once considered a protege of Mr. Netanyahu. He is a regular in the media. I want to read a quote from Mr. Bennett that he mentioned in the Israeli Knesset, telling an Arab Israeli member of the Israeli parliament, "When you were still swinging from the trees, we had a Jewish state here." So we don't know if Mr. Bennett will be an improvement on Mr. Netanyahu. His coalition partner is the great hope in the American media, the centrist Yair Lapid. He's a former journalist who also served as the Minister of Finance in 2014. The coalition agreement, as far as I know, states that in 2023 he takes over as the Prime Minister. And many commentators expect a Lapid premiership to be a departure from Mr. Netanyahu as well as Mr. Bennett, both of whom are considered hardliners on the Palestinian issue. Now, Mr. Lapid is certainly to the left of most people on this issue. He campaigned on a platform to restart serious negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. He calls for two states, but he wants to maintain the large illegal settlements, and he wants a united Jerusalem. Quote, in 2013, I quote Lapid, "We are not looking for a happy marriage with the Palestinians, but for a divorce agreement that we can both live with." He's against the one-state solution, which I will also discuss a little later on. He has called for the annexing of the Golan Heights, something which has virtually already happened. So if this is the best we can expect from a centrist, I think it reveals just how complex the issue is. In terms of the Palestinian elections, which have been promised since late 2019, the reporting suggests that the point of contention is the ability of Palestinians living in East Jerusalem to participate, something that should be a given. And not even pressure from the European Union has been able to deliver this for the Palestinian elections. For context, data from the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs places the death toll in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since 2008, the total death toll, at 5,850. The total Israeli deaths was 250. The total Palestinian deaths was 5,600. This reveals a startling lack of symmetry. The Zionist political project, just to give you a brief history, was extremely well organized with prominent proponents in the chambers of power in the United Kingdom and many parts of Europe. Now, a Jewish state was always on the colonial agenda since the early 1900s, since the turn of this century. Main reason was due to rising anti-Semitism in London, following the rapid expansion of the Jewish population there. Between the late 1800s and 1919, the Jewish population in the UK multiplied 5 times due to the Great Exodus following pogroms in Russia. In fact, the architect of the now famous Balfour Declaration, the former Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, was overtly against the continued arrival of Jewish refugees in the UK. The United Kingdom Zionist Organization even proposed the Uganda scheme in 1903 to create a Jewish homeland in British-controlled East Africa. The UK government offered the Zionist organization 13,000 square kilometers in the East African colony. That is 17 times the size of Singapore, but 40% the size of present-day Israel. Now, when you look briefly at Resolution 242 and the two-state solution, this is, as we said, supposedly the best known available solution. But there are Israeli scholars, I'll name two, Benny Morris, very famous Israeli scholar, and perhaps the most famous Israeli scholar, Menron Ben-Venesti, who has pointed out in an excellent paper, which is available online, that the implementation of the two-state solution would create what he calls Palestinian Bantustans. The Bantustan is a word that originates from South Africa and is a racially segregated community, which is a feature of apartheid South Africa. An EU report from the year 2000 states that the Israeli settlements would dilute and eventually extricate organic links between East Jerusalem and the West Bank. This is one community. It's like if we had a united Sri Lanka, but in between Kandy and Colombo, it's a different country. Organic links matter. For the decades-long failure to enforce some version of the famous Green Line, consequent frustrations regarding settlement expansions have led many to conclude that the two-state solution is essentially over, that there's no chance of it. Dr. Wijetileke states, and I quote, "The two-state solution has been rolled back by cynical, systematic building of illegal Israeli settlements in the land that should belong to a future Palestinian state. In order to make this two-state solution viable again, those settlements would have to go, or there should be compensatory land swaps. However, with each passing day, the Israelis have less land to swap. It is difficult to envisage that the US will be able to mount enough pressure to roll back these settlements. So this leaves the one-state solution, which has an interesting history. In recent years, the whistle was blown on the unviability of the two-state solution, firstly by Professor Richard Falk of Princeton University, the former UN Special Rapporteur on occupied Palestine, and he is also Jewish. Writing as recently as 2019, Professor Falk stated, I quote, "The zombie maneuvers of the past 20 or more years, with continued advocacy of long moribund two-state negotiations, must end. The only question is, what kind of state will emerge, secular or apartheid?" I quote Dr. Wijetileke again, "Given the apparent unviability of the two-state solution, the one-state solution is the only default option. But that too is a problem. As President Obama pointed out to the Israelis, time is not on their side because of demographics. If Israel will be unable to exist as a democratic Jewish state, if it is to continue to claim to be the sole democratic state in the region and thus the natural ally of the USA, it has to give citizenship, voting rights, and equal rights in general to all those that live within its borders. Now, this would mean enfranchising all the Palestinians in the annexed territories. This in turn would change the demographic ratio, bringing into view the possibility that Israel would be democratic but no longer Jewish. Conversely, Israel would remain Jewish by maintaining the status quo, but would increasingly be disqualified as democratic." But speaking in 2014, Professor Noam Chomsky described the one-state solution as implausible. He said, Israel's ability to take over the West Banks and have the Palestinians launch some sort of human rights movement or an anti-apartheid struggle would fail. He sees the second option as currently what exists. Israel carves up the West Bank in a way that integrates Israel into parts of the West Bank, the parts that they want. The developed suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the Jordan Valley, Ariel, which cover most of the major resources, water, and leaves out most of the Palestinian population. I'm sure everybody that follows this has heard of the Oslo Accords, a foundational aspect of a future peace deal. But this too was heavily criticized at the time. Almost 30 years later, I personally and many others feel that the criticism was vindicated. I'd like to discuss the work of Palestinian intellectual Professor Edward Said and his critique of the Oslo Accords, specifically the concessions made by Yasser Arafat. Anybody paying attention in 1993, and as a child I remember watching on the BBC, the PLO leader Yasser Arafat, Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, smiling cordially, shaking hands. There was a very young President Clinton. He's extremely tall, he's about 6'3". He was towering above them. He looked like a babysitter. And when you look at those pictures, you would think in the mid-90s, the Palestinian state is just around the corner, peace is just around the corner. But as Edward Said wrote in the week after, it's a famous essay, I'd urge everyone to go and read it, from October 1993, called The Morning After. He wrote of the, quote, spectacle, the degrading spectacle of Yasser Arafat thanking everyone for the suspension of most of his people's rights. Now, as per Said and many others, this agreement, heralded by the mainstream media, now a compulsory slab in the delicate foundation of the two-state solution, was inherently flawed. Mr. Said condemns the Accords as a vehicle to establish the authority of the PLO without considering more important things, such as what the main representative at the Washington negotiations, Ms. Hanan Ashrawi, has talked about. She has written that the Oslo Accords were initially negotiated in private, but they postponed the important questions around the agreement. This Washington track, as Ms. Ashrawi considers, she and her colleagues were discussing crucial elements, including the structure of the Palestinian state, the status of Jerusalem, control over the land and population registries. Dr. Wijetileke explains that Ms. Ashrawi understood the importance of building a strong intellectual lobby in Washington, D.C. Now, fast forward to the year 2000, from the Bill Clinton meeting to the next Bill Clinton meeting at Camp David, this time between Mr. Arafat and Ehud Barak. Mr. Barak was elected with a mandate to advance the peace process, but we all know how that went. Now, these issues were centered on the Palestinian right of return and land and population swaps. It has been speculated that an agreement was all but finalized 6 months later at the summit in Taba, Egypt. However, while the terms were agreeable, political shifts changed everything. In Israel, a right-wing shift signaled the arrival of Ariel Sharon and Likud, and in Palestine, the second intifada was raging. Now, anyone that looks at this conflict can't help but notice that there are very specific religious narratives that inform territorial boundaries. The media tends to tiptoe this crucial aspect for obvious reasons owing to religious sensitivity. But Dr. Wijetileke states that the Israelis erred by never accepting in their actions the UN resolution and by succumbing at first covertly and later overtly to an Old Testament notion of its boundaries. What Christopher Hitchens once said is that it would be very useful for everyone if Israel would tell us where it thinks its borders should be, if they would define their borders and tell everyone this is where it should be. Now, Hamas, just we mentioned them before, they do deal sometimes in religious fundamentalism. Their roots as a sub-branch of a Cairo-based organization. But we also have to mention the ultra-religious Shas Party. And I want to note the slogan used by Hamas in 2021 in the run-up to the elections was, "Jerusalem is our destiny." Likud, who I mentioned before, calls for a wiping out of even present-day Jordan. So in the context of Palestinian statehood, I just want everyone to consider how free a Palestinian state would be if the militant elements succeed and create a theocracy in Palestine. Would that be beneficial to Palestinian rights? Now, much has been made about the media's portrayal of the conflict in the past. The present escalation in May 2021 was no different. But luckily, in the recent decades, since I was a child, there have been different news organizations, not just the Western-centric media. Russia Today, the Doha-based Al Jazeera are just two. In brief, the main concern is that the media lacks consistency. It will not cover the Israeli settlement expansion, the evictions of Palestinians from their traditional lands, but when hostilities escalate, they play a both sides argument without the proper context. They also conflate the Palestinian leadership with Hamas. The US media receives the most accusations of bias. I want to quote Professor Noam Chomsky speaking in 2002 during the Intifada. Quote, "In the first days of the Intifada, Israel immediately began using what are called Israeli helicopters. They're not Israeli helicopters. They're US helicopters with Israeli pilots that were used to kill civilian complexes, that were used to attack civilians and destroy complexes. That was reported, and the US did react. The reaction, October 3rd, 2000. The Clinton administration made the biggest deal in a decade to send new helicopters, military helicopters, to Israel. So when you hear of the atrocities or in Gaza, say July 2002, 14 civilians killed by a helicopter missile attack, how did the American press respond to this? They did report helicopters attacking civilians, but the deal made by President Clinton and his administration went without report. Professor Chomsky, to be precise, noted that one column appeared in a single small newspaper in the state of Virginia, and that was all for the free press in the United States. The authors of the 2007 book, The Israel Lobby, John Mersheimer and Stephen Walt, refer both to formal and informal groups within the United States that influence the media. And Noam Chomsky discusses the sanitization, quote, "In the rule of proper sanitization of history, Palestinians carry out terrorism, Israelis retaliate, sometimes too harshly, but in the real world, the truth is often rather different." But Dr. Wijetileke thinks the tide is turning. And I believe YouTube, new media, social media, different platforms of distribution are allowing new voices to find an audience. I quote Dr. Wijetileke, "The last time Israel fought a war against Gaza, it went on for over 50 days. This time, it stopped in 1/5 the duration. It was the first time ever that the mood on the Arab street coincided with the moral outrage on the American streets and in the US Congress, putting pressure on the US government. From Gaza to New York and Chicago, from Jerusalem to Sydney, Palestinian flags were flying. One could not distinguish the coverage on CNN and the BBC from Al Jazeera. Israel has lost the war of public opinion in the West. And most significantly, the easy identification of President Trump and Netanyahu in the minds of young Americans have made this even worse. There is also a war in the media. There are several journalists, Mehdi Hassan, Abby Martin, Robert Fisk. They're noted for giving, in the US media, the Palestinian perspective. In 2018, the journalist Mark Lamont Hill was removed as a political commentator on CNN after a speech he made in support of Palestine. Abby Martin, a staunch supporter of the boycott, divest, and sanction movement, the BDS movement, which aims to pressure the Israeli government, was asked to sign an anti-BDS pledge at a university event in the state of Georgia. She refused to sign the pledge. The event was canceled, and she's currently in court against the state. Miss Emily Wilder, a journalist at the Associated Press, was sacked because of a campaign by fellow students at the Stanford University regarding her university activism for Palestine. You may have heard of the Somali-born Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from the state of Minnesota. She's been regularly called anti-Semitic from both her own party, the Democratic Party, as well as the Republicans, for very mild criticism of the Israel lobby. The right-wing media giant Fox News has regular segments which basically prop up the Israeli state. But even at the Fox News network, the Palestinian narrative is starting to gain traction. Mr. Geraldo Rivera, one of the most popular commentators on Fox News, is also partly Jewish through his mother's ancestry, but he's been arguing the case, and I quote his tweet, "American bombs should not be used to kill defenseless civilians in Gaza." And he's the only member of the right-wing media that agreed with the Palestinian American member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, when she stated that a $735 million weapons sale to Israel should be halted. Dr. Wijetileke sees the media shift as a significant factor. I quote, "The international media is no longer manufacturing consent for Israel. That is the biggest change I have seen in the recent Gaza conflict. There has been a shift in the consciousness of Western journalists and anchors as a result of the struggle against Trump and Trumpism. While Western journalists have shifted, so also have TV channels because of their own audience. The Israeli-Palestinian conversation thus is covered in far more balance today. The headway made in positively impacting the international media and world opinion is because of the sons and daughters of Professor Edward Said and Ms. Hanan Ashrawi, in terms of their discourse, how they address young audiences in the West. The strategic relations with Israel are a cornerstone of US foreign policy. There is no escaping that Israel has utilized US foreign policy to further its own objectives in the region. Political support from the most recent US President Donald Trump was forthcoming. The shifting of the embassy was symbolic. Suspending US aid to Palestine was cruel, as well as recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the water-rich Golan Heights. These are all straight out of the Netanyahu Israeli wish list, as well as ratcheting up tensions with Iran over the JCPOA and the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, not to mention the tweets in support of Benjamin Netanyahu's re-election campaign. The Trump peace plan was negotiated, and I say that almost in jest, because there was no input from the PLO. The Palestinians boycotted the Trump administration. The Trump plan keeps Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, recognizes Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank settlements, cancels the right of return, but did provide a separate state for the Palestinians, which came to 15% of historic Palestine. Mr. Trump is now out of office, but the PLO must contend with another president with a history of being pro-Israel. But President Joe Biden must contend with pressure from the left of his party, including the growing progressive caucus led by Senator Bernie Sanders. Although unfortunately, Mr. Biden has seemingly maintained his position on the JCPOA. Quoting Dr. Wijetileke, quote, "It is my hope and indeed my bet that Israeli society will not wish to be out of sync with mounting Western opinion. Netanyahu may hope that his friend Trump or someone with his views may make a comeback, but there's been a seismic shift in consciousness which will never snap back. Jewish values are no longer represented by Bibi Netanyahu and Benny Naftali. And three American figures of Jewish origin have contributed to this new justice-centered consciousness: Noam Chomsky, Bernie Sanders, and Richard Falk." Quote, "My hope and belief is that the Israeli society, culture, and politics will change for the better, bringing Israel more into congruence with the West, which it has contributed so much to. That, together with the emergence of an articulate young generation in Palestine, which is the real vanguard of the struggle this time, and the global voice of the Palestinian people, he believes will break the deadlock." I'd like to end by saying that in Sri Lanka, we have a proud history of support for the Palestinian people. Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa was a major supporter in the early days. But I'd also like to remind the audience that there was a United Nations General Assembly resolution passed in 1995 which determined that Zionism is a form of racism. This resolution was revoked by a campaign from President Bush Sr. in 1991 through another General Assembly resolution. However one feels about the contention of whether Zionism is a form of racism, I want everyone to note that Sri Lanka's president at the time, in the early 90s, President Ranasinghe Premadasa, despite pressure from the United States, voted against revoking this resolution. Sri Lanka at the time was the only non-Islamic country and the only non-communist-led country to vote. So I think going forward, given the current dynamic in Sri Lankan politics, Palestine will have many friends in Sri Lanka. I also want to finish with a final quote from Dr. Wijetileke. "In history, miracles do happen. and Israel and Palestine is the most obvious place for it. So thank you once again for having me here. Thank you to the Friends of Palestine. And please count me as a friend in your struggle. Thank you and have a good day.